Hello.
Hi, how's it going? Can you hear me well and
Yes, I
see?
can hear you.
My face is so big on the screen. I'm gonna have to get used to that. Uh,
It is an adjustment. It's an
yeah,
adjustment. I'm used to it now, but when I first started doing these, it was like, whoa,
yeah.
what am I doing? Yeah, welcome.
Thank
This
you
is
very
our
much.
it's our 12th conversation of season 3 of Niche Conversations, and I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian history and environment, and today I am joined by Andrew Candela. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly, yeah. Hi, my name's Andrew Candela, and I live in Vancouver on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I grew up in Smithers, British Columbia, on the Wet'suwet'en lands there. And yeah, I've been a bit of a scholar for the last couple of years at UBC. Now I'm teaching at a college called Vancouver Community College. I teach literacy and numeracy there. And yeah, the work I produced work kind of entered well into the visual cultures of the Circumpolar North series. So I was
Awesome.
pleased to kind of apply for this and try to talk about what I'd done and what you were doing as well,
Yeah.
what the series is doing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a great post, and the series was edited by Isabel Gapp and Mark Cheatham. There's part 1 and part 2 that people can check out, and there's rumors of a part 3 coming. Isabel
Awesome.
might be convinced. There's a demand. This is a very popular series. So, yeah, we're going to be talking about your post, Meet the Arctic, the Authentic, Domestic, and Federal North, 1955 to 1959. And I thought we would start off with a more broader question, which was, what was Canada's relationship to the Arctic in the 1950s, and why does this decade mark a change in the can't talk like it's a changing point in Canadian relations with the North?
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of question to open it up with,
Mm-hmm.
and probably the hardest question of all too, because whenever people try to say, oh, this is the turning point, I
Mm-hmm.
think historians are always like, well, there's a long series of events that actually led up to that point. So I guess those are the kinds of things before the 1950s. There's a great quote that I used in the thesis by a federal bureaucrat. His name was A.J. Phillips, and he was an Arctic administrator
Mm-hmm.
in the 50s and 60s. And the quote comes up in a conversation about Canada's long history of federal neglect to the Arctic, and that's sort of the way that a lot of bureaucrats, characterize the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in terms of their involvement in the Arctic and the North. And he calls it either criminal absenteeism or benign neglect. So those are the two kind of ambivalent terms that this administrator uses to characterize whether or not the government was sort of upholding its sort of responsibilities and
Mm-hmm.
duties to northern people and citizens. So I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about previous to the 1950s. Like how the government thought about the
Mm-hmm.
Arctic. There are a lot of reasons why the government maybe would characterize itself in that regard. Um, it did have a department, and there are departments that kind of continue this Arctic administration. At the time, it was the of Indian Affairs and National Resources that was sort of tasked with managing Arctic space and people and doing sort of administrative things. And there's a pretty long and rich history of what efforts existed in the pre-1915 period, but relied mostly on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and various church organizations and the Hudson Bay Company to kind of unfold all the sort of pieces of state administration. So, movement of goods,
Mm-hmm.
counting who lives there, dealing with, yeah, the kind of day-to-day requirements of life, housing, food, this kind of stuff. And those three organizations were primarily responsible for that kind of administration of northern space up until the 1950s, where it sort of starts to change. And I think this is a really interesting kind of, I don't know, problem for Canada, or at least comparison for Canada vis-a-vis other countries, especially European countries, where the state, you know, sometimes 200 years ago has really collected all of these administrative kind of wings, like the military, the church, and different sort of threads of capitalism, and kind of incorporated it into its body. And Canada had done so and had kind of been building up its administration in the South up through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but hadn't really done the same thing with the North. So the 1950s is a kind of culmination and a gathering in of these different administrative institutions under federal kind of administrative power, I suppose. And you know, some of the reasons are for that that change. Well, the distant early warning line was built, started being built in 1947, and so there were these big kind of projects that were moving along northern space in collaboration with American engineers and builders and Canadian laborers and people. So that project drew in a lot of sort of attention to northern space as a kind of Cold War space. And so Canadian people and administrators started thinking more about how presence should be kind of manifested there. Another reason is that the fur trade, which had been operating pretty successfully as an economy underlying Arctic, Arctic economies. It was the collapse of that economy was happening throughout the sort of 1930s, and it was clear that it would no longer serve the interests, I suppose, as much as it had previously of the Hudson Bay Company and the indigenous people who were very much involved in that economy. Yeah, so those are two kind of big reasons that transformed this. The federal government really had a more kind of preservationist attitude towards Arctic, like let's preserve the space and the people and try to keep it as sort of untouched and unmodernized in a lot of ways. And then these kind of crises, the dew line, the collapse of the fur trading economy, and another public relations crisis too also emerged to sort of push the federal government into promoting an idea that it was no longer going to maintain a kind of preservationist attitude, but was going to become interventionist. And that was the publication of Farley Mowat's book, People of the Deer, which precipitated a almost more globally than domestically within Canada, but a sense of deep kind of federal neglect coupled with sort of settler kinds of greed at exploiting the indigenous people, the resources and the lands of the kind of Eastern Arctic, the place that Farley Mowat wrote about. And the government was very much embarrassed, basically, as being a criminal absentee kind of, you know, paternalistic state, like neglecting its space. And so that was the kind of what I think of as the third sort of reason that it moved to kind of act in a kind of public relations way and in a practical way too, to start deeply administrating the life of people and resources more so in the North. So those are the kind of three reasons I think. Yeah,
that's great. Great, that was. I just learned a lot from you. I didn't know that Farley Mowat's like writing had that much of an impact.
that book
that's
was
really interesting to me.
that book, People of the Deer, was
Yeah.
debated in Parliament
Wow.
as to the sort of degree of its claims to truth about the experiences of the Keewatin people.
Mm.
And that book it discusses some of the botched relocation initiatives undertaken by the federal government. And yeah, I know there was a lot of debate as to how true his account of the North and the Arctic was. And it
Mhm.
became a really powerful public relations issue. Time magazine wrote reports on what was happening in the Northern Arctic. And interestingly, too, a lot of the American military engineers and commanders who were part of the DEW line were
Mhm.
actually openly shaming Canada and the Canadian government, saying, you have no infrastructure in the North. You have no clean water in the North. You have no houses in the North. You are not being responsible for your citizens of the North. And the Canadian government was sort of pushed by public shaming in a lot of ways to try to produce a response to those critiques. And yeah, so kind of interesting how, yeah, the court of public opinion worked to, I think, precipitate a deeper involvement from the federal government at that time.
Cool. That's fascinating. Okay, so what you've described is kind of like a time period of deep anxiety, federal Canadian governmental anxiety. And they
Yeah.
come up with this idea, which is the Meet the Arctic
Yeah.
exhibit. So, what was this exhibit?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it, like the anxiety and concern. And so the
Mm,
exhibit is this answer to the Canadian public. And I kind of think about this answer from a term that a scholar named Zoe Druick came up with to talk about a genre of kind of government culture. And
mm,
she calls it government realism. And she uses it in terms of discussing documentary film and how it's this kind of creative presentation of reality to a public. And so
mm,
documentary films are this kind of creative presentation of reality. And it's a government reality. It's like what government is supposed to be doing. Um, so yeah, all this anxiety around the Arctic space and the sort of tragedies and illness and like low life expectancy for people in the North. It's all this swirl of bad publicity for the Arctic and what the federal government is doing. And so they come up with this exhibit, and I guess it makes sense because this is in the sort of pre-televised
yeah,
era. I think if this had happened in the 1960s, it would have just been a series of like heritage moment kinds of
yeah.
commercials. But it was in 1955, and coast to coast television was just sort of getting its sort of feet wet, so to speak. So the Meet the Arctic exhibit is this mobile, kind of like a menagerie and collection of all things that are supposed to manifest the North. The centerpiece, probably the most important thing about this exhibit, is a styrofoam igloo. And the igloo is carved by, very importantly for the federal government, an Inuit person who they say is authentic. And this is a famous artist named Peter Pitsiolek,
Mhm.
um, who is a photographer and historian, spent most of his time in Kinnegad. And he is hired by the federal government to carve a styrofoam igloo that is the sort of centerpiece of the Meet the Arctic exhibit. He's photographed doing this, and there are sort of government communications about how he's using his sort of like craft and knowledge of real igloos to carve this styrofoam igloo for a display. And the display or the exhibit, it first shows at the Canadian National Exhibition in 1955. So the CNE, now it's called the X. These are like, long-standing fairs,
Yeah.
basically. So the igloo is the centerpiece. Surrounding the igloo are a variety of different objects and people that are gathered from the north. So this is sort of like your classic colonial style display of all the possessions of empire
Mhm.
or colony that are taken from different Arctic spaces, from west to east Arctic. And there's a couple of things here. So some of the archives that I looked through, you've got a woman's parka from the Western Arctic, lined, fur trimmed. You've got a sealskin parka and pants. You've got caribou mitts, square flipper skin, dolls dressed in sealskin,
Mhm.
caribou skins. You have a tea kettle, frying pan. There's eider nest and eggs sort of arranged in the display. There's a shoehorn in the display. There's a Primus stove, and what else? A few other things.
Yeah.
Those are sort of the small objects. There's a summer side and a winter side to the Arctic display. So the winter side is spears, furs. There's
Mhm.
styrofoam snow at the front, and there's sort of an entry way with a sign in Inuk saying "Welcome to the Arctic." At the back, however, there are bales of reindeer moss that they actually gathered to put in the back, and there's hanging furs in the back, and there's sort of representations of summer life in the Arctic too.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to, all season sort of kind of thing. The first display in 1955 is really interesting because it's part of kind of convincing Canadians that they should think about the Arctic, and I'm talking about sort of like settler, southern living,
Mhm.
kind of Caucasian or European descent Canadians. It's trying to convince them that the Arctic is part of the kind of Canadian family. And it's using a lot of carrots to kind of promote this idea too. So the first display, there's a polar projection map in the center of the display next to the igloo. And there are samples of uranium and ore around the display. And measuring these samples is a Geiger counter uh, producing these kinds of clicks and ticks to sort of audibly register the radioactivity of these stones. And this is supposed to tell people that there's wealth. There's this kind of mysterious wealth and resources that are part of the Arctic. There's also the igloo in this display. And there's two people, two young men in this first display, Donnie Avicana and Johnny Eskenack, handing out copies of this booklet called Rise, the True North. And so in addition to all that, there's a model walking through the display wearing a fur coat and showing the sort of the fur-based resources of the North. There's the styrofoam igloo and there's these pamphlets. And so this is the first iteration, and it kind of grows over the course of the 5 years that the display
Mhm.
travels around Canada. It actually gets bigger and bigger. More objects start coming in. People dress in more sort of stereotypically Arctic kinds of ways.
Mhm.
And yeah, so it's this moving mobile display. It's like imagining a campy kind of, I don't know, movie made about the Arctic in this decade, and you can kind of imagine it looking a
Yeah.
little bit campy. And I have some of the images in my
Yeah.
thesis and on the site too that shows some pictures of it too. So yeah, it's pretty wild, and I think really the one of the very, very important things about the exhibition is this materiality of it. Like it's supposed to be, it's supposed to bring authentic objects, and I use that term a lot, to the
Yeah.
Southern Canadian audiences. But the
Mhm.
centerpiece object is the styrofoam igloo, which people aren't familiar with at all. Styrofoam is really new and unfamiliar to a kind of widespread population of Canadians. Canada Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's this menagerie of people, objects, and the styrofoam igloo as a kind of centerpiece. And finally, it's placed all the time in spaces that are dedicated to a kind of feminized domesticity. So it's shown in the food center. It's shown in the women's center in all these spaces, these fairground spaces across Canada. So it's meant to bring a kind of wild and uncertain north into a domestic, feminized space
Yeah.
for the consumption of the viewer, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so it's very fascinating, and I love that like subtle connection to the history of plastics with that
Mm,
styrofoam introduction. That's really cool. There's something to analyze there, definitely.
totally.
Um,
Plastics were so exciting for people and very much utopian and kind of the answer to housing problems, affordability problems, everything. And so this was kind of pinning those big post-war hopes on this a plastic object,
yeah,
really.
wild. Yeah, and then like it's not because some of those objects that you're describing, I've definitely seen in other museums or exhibits,
Hmm.
so it's not necessarily the individual objects, right? It's like the way they're presented together and the overarching
Hmm.
message that's being transferred. So you've touched upon it, but maybe finish up by maybe more directly talking about who is the audience and what was the message they were supposed to
Hmm.
walk away with.
Yeah, that's a tough question. In some ways, it's like who's the audience for a federal commercial, right?
Yeah.
Like who are the audiences for the documentaries about Canadian history and heritage moments? I think it's in some sense it's the same audience. It's like the Canadian citizen who's supposed to be um, in like being introduced to the Arctic, who's maybe foreign to the Canadian sensibility and now is being sort of introduced as part of the family. And so I think there's this sort of early multiculturalism idea that's being promoted, although it's yeah, a contentious multicultural idea that I don't know is one that people agree with or should support, but
Yeah.
it's the beginning of this idea that we're a kind of collective,
Mm.
eclectic, folky family. And so at the fairs where this is being presented, there are many displays of sort of folk heritage that are happening concurrently, and this is just it's a kind of big way that people communicate identity in this period is these kinds of displays. So the audience is general Canadians. It's also Canadians who are angry at the federal government too, because
Mm.
people don't believe that the government is following through with their promises of sort of the post-war good life in the Arctic because they've heard all these stories about malnutrition and tragedy and relocation from the news and from Farley Mowat. People come to this display and interact with it with quite a bit of cynicism and
Mm.
incredulity. And so it's a kind of massaging of people's perceptions. There are the Inuit attendees who are talking about their life and are federal civil servants who are at the display. So they're not criticizing the federal government. They're kind of talking about the programs that the government is doing. And then there are people at the displays like Irene Baird, who's a very sophisticated civil servant in charge of communications. And she's talking about the good work that the government is trying to do. And so it's recognizing that the audiences might have a bit of a problem
Mm.
with the way that the government has thought and treated the Arctic, but it's sort of tackling that problem head on.
Mm.
I think that's another audience member.
Yeah.
And then I do think it's just kind of part of this fair, like people who are looking to consume difference, which the fair is all about consuming differences and exploring a kind of fantasy, you know, a place outside people's normal everyday life. So people who buy a ticket to the PNE or the Calgary Stampede, those are the people who would be encountering the Meet the Arctic exhibit. They'd be walking through and being told in the copy that there are real Inuit people, which was exciting, I suppose, for them, and that there's a real igloo. And so they want to go see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's so important to point out that the like part of the audience were people who were critical of
Mm-hmm.
critical of this exhibit, because I think particularly, you know, like white liberals like to look back in the past and be like, oh, they weren't critically thinking about they were just like taking it in, you know, there weren't people who were thinking about this kind of stuff back then. I think there's often like a short-sightedness in the how deep-seated a lot of these ideas, not only the colonial ideas, but the ideas that were challenging the systems. Like we didn't invent it, right? So I think it's really important to point out. Yeah, interesting.
Totally. Yeah, it is. And I think the kind of the real irony of this is that people were very critical about the idea of neglect, that the government had really neglected
Mm-hmm.
and wasn't treating the Arctic and the people of the Arctic in the same way that it treated the people of the South, which is absolutely a reasonable critique. But the sad part of it is that the response to it is the intensity of intervention across the board. And it's not a response that says, okay, well, let's set up, you know, autonomous indigenous governments or a system by which people can really kind of direct their own sorts of destinies. It's the kind of colonial liberal welfare state that gets just like thrown down, probably like in a way that I think is really quite incomprehensible. Like it's just the scope of the sort of social services and the programs and the people trying to kind of remake the Arctic are really just wildly comprehensive.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's a whole other decade of decades of problems and issues for
Mm-hmm.
other people to write about.
Yes, that continues to this day.
Yeah,
Um, wow. Thank you, Andrew. This was
my
a
pleasure.
fascinating conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Everyone should check out your piece. There's some images in there that will help contextualize some of the stuff we talked about today. And yeah, it was great. Thanks for
Awesome.
joining.
Thank you so much for having
Yeah,
me. Take care.
take care. Bye.
Bye.